My name is Kirsten Moss. I'm the Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Stanford. I think this is interesting today because as I've talked to folks who are investors within the finance world, so that's venture capital, private equity, at hedge funds, what we find about 20% of our class is from those three industries, and about 65% of them, as they're coming in, say that they will return to investing. They're interested in that. And about the other third are often interested in operating roles. So today on our panel, you will see that we really have a wonderful mixture. About 2/3 went back to finance, and 2 are now taking on more operating roles, or even an operating role within finance, more entrepreneurial roles. So you'll get a flavor of both of those kinds of careers. So with that, I'm going to turn to our panel, and I'm going to start and ask each of the panelists as I introduce them to give you a little bit of information about their background, and then answer the question of what their favorite academic experience was at the GSB to get us started. So Manuel, maybe you could kick us off, please.
Sure, thanks. Hi everyone, this is Manuel Aleman, actually from Colombia right now, but I am originally from El Salvador. I am a class of 2014. As you can see, I'm the oldest one here. I feel old already. It's been 6 years since I left the GSB. It seems like less than that. I did my undergrad in El Salvador. I studied economics. After my undergrad, I went to work in consulting for a couple of years, and then in private equity. I was based in Costa Rica doing private equity, seeing the Central America and Andean region in South America. I decided that I wanted to do something else with my career. I decided that I wanted to do something more entrepreneurial. I thought, and I was correct, that the best place to do that was at the GSB. I went to the GSB, and during my time in there, I was looking for things to do back in Latin America related to entrepreneurship and specifically to consumer finance. We didn't talk about fintech back then, but I was interested in consumer finance and serving the underbanked population in Latin America. So after GSB, I joined a startup. It was a small startup of 30 people back then called Alpha Credit. That this startup had operations in Mexico. I joined to be the general manager of something that didn't exist. I joined to expand Alpha Credit to Colombia. So I moved to Colombia, and as an interesting experience, I came to Colombia with 2 bags and 1 Airbnb, and worked at the Starbucks for the first 6 months. Fast forward 5 years, we are now in Colombia a team of 300 people. We have served tens of thousands of people in Colombia who are underbanked, and our portfolio is something more of $100 million in loans that we have disbursed to underbanked population in Colombia. That's just Colombia, and Alpha Credit as a whole. We've been growing very fast, in both countries, Mexico and Colombia. We just closed our Series B, led by SoftBank, and we are still expanding pretty fast. And I will be happy to talk more about the transition from private equity to operational role as a GM of a country. And to your question, Kristen, of what was my favorite experience, academic experience, it was there's a class that I guess that is still there, called Acting with Power, which is amazing. It's an amazing class, which for me reflects a lot about the GSB, because the class has a component, I would guess that something around 20 to 30%, that is lecture readings of what power means. This is something that's really interesting about how we, as usually very young people, are comfortable with power or not in different situations. So this class was created by a PhD in psychology who had done some research on power. It was thought by her, but it was also taught by actors. So we had actors teaching us how to literally act. So that was so much fun because you had the theory about power and how do you have to behave and what do you have to do. And then we have acting classes outside, in different rooms of how do you perform. And the first classes were just how to act. So we were act Hamlet, that was pretty fun. And then you would act with power, like, okay, so now you are the CEO, you are the GM, you are the investor, you are in a table with another company that you want to acquire. How do you act? And it was taught by actors, which was amazing. So that was one of the most useful classes for me. I definitely have used that. As you can see, I still think I am young to be in the position that I am. So I had to use that several times in my career in the last 5 years, and that was my favorite experience.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you, Manuel. How about you, Jeff? Will you let us know a little about your background and your favorite academic experience?
Sure. Tough act to follow, given that I don't have nearly as much experience or as interesting of a track. But yeah, my name is Jeff. I was class of 2019, so been out for about a year now. Grew up and went to school near Toronto in Canada, which is where most of my family still is. After undergrad, worked at Goldman for 2 years in investment banking, and then worked at Carlyle for 2 years in private equity, doing consumer and retail investing there. All along, I was kind of sitting on the deferred acceptance program on the Stanford side, so it was something I was looking forward to. The whole time along, nothing about my work experience had changed those plans. So I started at Stanford, and then when I graduated, I came to Bain Capital. So my first year in Boston, although moving to the New York office this month. So that's kind of the quick intro on me. And then, in terms of favorite academic experience, I think there's one that stands out that, is career related. And I think there's one that stands out that was a little bit more, tangential or, if not totally unrelated. I think that from a finance perspective, there was a class that I had taken called Alphanomics that, was really about stock picking, both through, qualitative and quantitative methods. And for me, that always felt like a bit of a black box sitting on the private equity side of the wall. So it was great to get some insight into that. And then in terms of non-finance material, I had taken a class called Managing Difficult Conversations. And it was taught by two professors. One was actually the head of pediatrics at the Stanford Hospital, and the other was a former senior partner from McKinsey. And every day before class, we would read a case about usually a health-related emergency. I mean, they were usually these cases were usually designed in the context of healthcare, but you would be there in the class of 20 or 30 people, and two people would get called up to role play what was always an impossible conversation. And then the professors would weigh in on what they thought went well, what they thought didn't go well, but students would also weigh in on where one another were showing enough empathy or where they could have said things differently, where they could have done more to console and provide support and things like that. So I think that I'd be lying if I said it wasn't the most uncomfortable hour and 45 minutes of my week every week, but I think it's something I'll remember. I learned a lot, and I think that unfortunately for a lot of people, you don't really get a test run of those sorts of conversations until you're sitting there. So I feel like that was something that Stanford gave me access to. It was pretty special.
Great, thank you. Emily, how about you?
Hi, I'm Emily Carroll. I just graduated from the GSB a couple of weeks ago in June, so I'm the most recent grad here. I grew up in Michigan and then graduated from the University of Michigan. I moved to New York first with BCG and then transitioned into private equity at a firm called Hellman & Friedman. I came to the GSB after 3 years there and ultimately decided to go back into private equity. I now work for the PE firm within the hedge fund Viking Global. So I can talk a little bit about that transition and what that was like as well. In terms of my favorite academic experience at Stanford, I kind of changed the answer that I had a few times here while you guys were talking. It's honestly kind of hard to pick, and a lot of them are pretty fresh for me, but I would say that one that stands out as unique, I took a class about how to pivot in your career that was co-taught between a woman named Allison Kluger and then Alex Rodriguez of the New York Yankees. So certainly a more unique experience, but we talked about a lot of things that even though I didn't make such a drastic career pivot, I think were really helpful for me. One was talking about what your strengths were and just getting really crisp about them on paper and how you would articulate it and where it might possibly serve you. And the class culminated in you pitching that on live TV on like a local Mountain View radio or TV station that I hope didn't have any viewers, but was a really helpful experience for me in terms of being better about advocating for myself and thinking about what my strengths were. So it was really helpful for me.
Oh, that's great. Katie, how about you?
Hi guys, my name is Katie Hayes. I have a very similar start to my career from what Jeff shared. I'm also from Toronto, Canada, and also started my career in investment banking at Goldman. I was in New York, focused on healthcare, and was always really interested in the healthcare industry, which was kind of what brought me to the US from Canada. And from there, I went to a firm called Madison Dearborn Partners in Chicago and was in private equity for 2 years, and then came to the GSB. And my goal at the GSB was really to learn more about earlier stage companies. Like I had worked with kind of these bigger Fortune 500 and buyout type companies, but I really wanted to learn about smaller companies where I thought, you know, you're closer to the founder, closer to the story. And it just, to me, got me more excited and energized. And so had the opportunity, obviously, to do that through, you know, a lot of different courses and internship experiences while at the GSB, which I'll talk about my favorite one, which was, you know, certainly related to small companies. And then after the GSB, I knew that I wanted to go back into investing in some capacity, but at the smaller companies, I knew I didn't really have experience yet, like working, you know, really doing anything other than being an investor and kind of a service provider. So I worked for 18 months at a company called Open Care, which is a Toronto-based healthcare startup, launching a new product for them. It was by far like the most stressful, challenging role, way more stressful than investment banking, to be managing, you know, sales and the P&L and budget and the team and all of that stuff. But ultimately joined a VC firm in Toronto, a brand new fund actually. So it's kind of a startup and VC fund called Whittington Ventures. And I focus mostly on healthcare investments and got to be back in my hometown in Toronto. And then my most favorite academic experience at the GSB was a class called Managing Growing Enterprises. It's a pretty popular class to take, especially for second years. The one that I took was taught with Garth Saloner, who's the former dean of the GSB, and then Jim Ellis, who's this kind of awesome, you know, investor and an entrepreneur. And I would kind of describe this class as like the How I Built This podcast, but in real life. So each week you're kind of going through the stories of these different founders of really, you know, a lot of them are very large, successful companies like Bonobos and DoorDash. And what's really, really cool about it is it's all alumni of the GSB and often actually alumni of that course. So multiple times the speakers actually said, oh, I sat in that seat when I took this course. And I remember like, this was what stuck with me and what I brought to my business. So it was super, super cool. And definitely recommend taking it for everyone who does end up coming to the GSB.
Awesome. And Valerie. Valerie Shen.
I'm Valerie. I was also class of 2019 with Jeff and also a deferred admit. And then I also did a joint master's in environment and resources, so graduated in December. My background is I studied environmental science in undergrad, have always been really interested in climate change and clean energy and the intersection of business and politics and science to make that all happen. Right out of college, as someone who was interested in business but didn't know exactly what to do, I went to McKinsey for 1.5 years. And then I went to Kleiner Perkins after that and joined the Green Growth Fund, which was a team investing in sustainability and clean tech. And while I was there, that fund was in the process of spinning out and creating G2VP, which is a new entity investing in the digitization of traditional industries. So I helped with the operational aspects of setting that fund up, helped with our first investment, then came to the GSB for 2.5 years, and I'm now back at G2VP as the Chief Operating Officer. So what I do now is basically run our fund as a business. So everything other than investing decisions sort of falls under my purview. My favorite class at the GSB, so my favorite professor is this guy, Keith Hennessy. He was one of President Bush's top economic advisors. And I took a bunch of his classes, all of which are awesome. The one that was most interesting was this class called How to Make Economic Policy. And the whole thing was a simulation of Congress. So there was a presidential election, everyone was given a role as a member of Congress, and then we had to negotiate with each other to try and pass a bill. And it was this all-encompassing experience where even outside of class, you were constantly trying to negotiate to pass the bill. And it really helped you understand why it's so difficult. But love the class, love Keith. And I'm excited to be here with you all.
Awesome, thank you. So thank you, panelists, for introducing yourself. And I'm going to launch onto a few questions first before we get to those from the audience. So one of the things that we hear when I speak with people who are in finance, who are in investing and would like to continue when they graduate is, what's the value of an MBA? Why, you know, can I learn just as much by staying at my firm and continuing to work on more deals? So Jeff and Emily, I'll start with you, Jeff, first. Both of you were in PE, now you've returned. If you look back, what do you think the impact of your MBA was, and how did Stanford contribute to that?
Sure. So I can take a crack at it. I mean, I think to the initial question of, you know, why, you know, if you're in private equity looking to go back into private equity or stay in private equity, why think about it? I mean, I was looking at it a few different ways. You know, I think first at the kind of most macro level, you know, I was just sort of thinking about, you know, first, if the reason people, you know, work and make money is to enable experiences, then, you know, why not kind of use that time and use that money to enable one of the best experiences that I could find? I mean, trading notes with any alum, they had basically said those were some of the best 2 years that I, you know, had ever had. So to me, that was a worthwhile trade-off. But then even at the more kind of micro career level, you know, for me, I would say the two firms that I've worked at so far, being Bain and Carlyle, you know, for promotion, going to business school was still a bit of a prerequisite for both of those guys. You know, there were very few opportunities to get promoted right through. They preferred that folks, you know, went back to business school, acquired some new skills, built a bit of a new network. So, you know, for me, part of it was just thinking that this is sort of the path that everybody who's done really well in my career has gone through. So I think that shaped the way I was thinking about it. And then lastly, knowing that I had an interest in maybe switching firms as well, I also really got the sense that recruiters at firms like Bain and Carlyle just had a preference to hire through a campus process to fill VP slots rather than trying to hire through headhunters on more of an off-cycle kind of basis. So I also felt like it was the best way to get a few good looks. But yeah, that's sort of the macro and the micro. I mean, I think the macro was really about me, and it seemed like a great experience and a place where I would learn a lot and have a lot of fun. But even at the more micro level, you know, it felt like from a career perspective, it was sort of the more trodden path.
Great. Emily?
Yeah, I think I share a lot of your thinking, Jeff, in terms of why I chose to come to Stanford. The first reason I think that was most prominent for me at the time was I was very fortunate at that time to have a lot of different options. And while I could have stayed and without having an MBA necessarily and pursued some of them, I think I didn't necessarily have enough conviction in any one of them. And for me, just having 2 years to think about what did I want and which one of those things was most interesting to me was really valuable. I was thinking about operating roles. I was thinking about hedge funds, earlier stage investing, and I could kind of make a case for why any of them were interesting. And having 2 years to really reflect on that, as well as one bullet in an internship, was really valuable to actually try something else out. So that was the thing that was most on my mind at the time. Other things that Jeff also mentioned, I think what firm fits you the best. I think, you know, you can be in PE and you want to stay in PE, but that looks really different at a bunch of different places. And For me, having the opportunity to talk to a lot of different firms and think about what might be a better fit for me was really helpful. The firm that I'm joining, for example, only hires MBAs. So if that's the type of fund that's interesting to you, I think thinking about what kinds of doors it opens in terms of credentials and just recruiting access is really important. And then last, I also just decided at the end it was an experience I wanted to have. And while it added value to my life in a bunch of different ways, one was certainly just fun and experience and doing something different. And I can imagine that many people coming from finance are feeling burned out in a number of ways. And it, I think for me, was a helpful reset in terms of what's important to me, and making a lot of lifelong lasting friendships, I think was a really great and valuable experience too.
Awesome. Thank you, Emily. You know, at Stanford, really, we believe that our admits have the power to change lives, change organizations, change the world. That's been our motto. So I'm curious for Manuel and for Valerie, both of you are now in C-level roles early in your careers. How did Stanford help you achieve, you know, pivot from where you were to achieve that role? Maybe we'll start with you, Manuel.
Sure, it was. I mean, the way I think about it, you know, it would have been almost impossible for me, at least in my personal case, to be in a role like this without having gone to Stanford, period. So when I was still in private equity and I was thinking that I wanted to do something more entrepreneurial and something with more hands-on responsibility, I look at my options, you know, and I thought, well, I want to do something impactful and large, and being a mid-level guy in private equity, being open to me many doors, you know, in doing something large and impactful. Honestly, I saw my options and they weren't that great or that large, so going to Stanford just made a lot of sense for me. You know, when I thought, what is the best place there is to look for something entrepreneurial to do, Stanford was top of the list for sure. And in my current role, what, you know, how I got where I am is that I just met through a Stanford network a couple of great entrepreneurs who were based in Mexico, and there wasn't, you know, there was a click. You know, basically half of their investors are from the GSB network. Among them, Jim Ellis, for example, who was mentioned here, is one of the investors. So there was, you know, just this whole network connection that we had in common, that for me was the key factor for which I decided to join the startup, and they decided to give me a very important role, you know, as the leader of a country and as the founder of a country. And that was it. You know, basically the only reason why I am doing what I'm doing is because I went to Stanford. If I hadn't done that, you know, if I would have gone to the same founders as a, you know, analyst from a private equity firm, that just wouldn't happen, period. So yeah, that was my experience.
Thank you, Manuel. How about you, Valerie? How do you think about it?
So I think it's been a really interesting experience because I actually now work with the same people that I worked with right before the GSB, doing like work that's sort of in the same sector of the org, but at a much more senior level. So before I came to the GSB, I would really tee up a lot of decisions for my partners to make. And now I'm in a position where I can actually make the decision and just let them know what happened. And I think two aspects of the GSB really helped with that. The first is you really just learn a ton of best practices. And we're a pretty small venture capital fund, just 10 people in the process of setting everything up. So when you think about hiring and firing, the class Katie mentioned, Managing Growing Enterprises, teaches you how to practice that, all the operational setup, even best practices on comp and just like how you manage the org. I think I learned a lot that would have taken much longer to learn on the job. And then the part that I think is probably even more important is the GSB really helps you develop a lot of confidence. And I think it's some aspect of you just see all these people paraded in class as speakers who are really not that many years older than you. And you know that they were also sort of clowns like you a few years ago, and now they run places. And it helps you figure out that like, we too can run the world. And it makes me confident making decisions, knowing that if I tried to tee this decision up to someone else, they're not actually more equipped than me. And I should just figure out what's best based on what I see. The GSB, I think, is by far, to me, the most confidence building experience. And that's going to be really powerful.
That's great. Thank you. Katie, I'd like to turn this one to you. So business school is an opportunity to build your community of supporters. How would you describe the GSB community and its impact on you?
Yeah, so I think the GSB community is like really just phenomenal. I think that probably goes without saying, but I think a couple of different ways that it impacted me that I maybe didn't expect coming into business school. One, I always thought about, okay, here's this group of students that are in my year. I'm going to form friendships, and then somewhere down the road, there's going to be this nebulous network effect, and it's going to be awesome. And I don't know what they're going to do, but there's going to be something great there. What I think I did not appreciate was that these are like just some of the most deep and impactful friendships that you can have. And it's so amazing because, you know, I only met these people for me 4 years ago. So I've, you know, friends that have gone through major life events, highs, lows, etc. And I'm calling these folks along with like people that I've known for 20, 25 years. And I really do put them like on that same level. I think at the GSB, people's ability to go deep really quickly and really focus on stuff beyond your resume or beyond your careers, but more like your goals and what makes you tick and you know, what you're bringing into the room is really cool. And I think that's something that I've also noticed, something that I did not expect, which was that really translates across years. So in VC, I spend a lot of time talking to companies and getting to know founders. And like even today, for example, I was talking to 2 different GSB founders from years, you know, totally different from mine. We did not overlap at the GSB, but that community and that shared understanding of, you know, the maturity that people get while they're at business school really, really kind of resonates. And I found it in almost everyone that I've talked to from the GSB from, I think, I've got a call tomorrow with someone from class of 67 at the GSB. Wow. And today I was talking to a 2016. So really, really a wide range. And then the second thing I would say is also, I didn't expect to connect with the professors as much as I did. We did something I was in a pass down house, which is like a house with 6 fellow students in second year. And we hosted these weekly dinners with professors from a bunch of our classes. And I really enjoyed that experience. And I don't think I appreciated how much they genuinely wanted to get to know students and really wanted to invest in those relationships. So that was another kind of surprising upside of the community.
Awesome. And Katie, you talked about the willingness to go deep. Was it talks, small group dinners? Was there what was it for you that really helped you connect at that level?
Yeah, I think it was all of the above. I think even just kind of the first week at the GSB, like just getting to know people, whether it was in the residences or walking around having lunch in like Arbuckle, which is the main dining hall, you know, you'd sit down with someone and I mean, maybe it's because like the weather's great every day, so you can't talk about the weather. I'm Canadian, so that's usually like a conversation topic. But people would just be like, so what are like, you know, how are you really doing? Or stuff like that. I think it was just really all of those things. But I definitely think that talk was an incredible way. I was fortunate enough to do a talk, which is a, you know, kind of short version of your life where you get to share yourself to the GSB. Those certainly, I think, set the precedent a little bit. And then from there, people opened up.
That's great. Jeff, I'm going to pass this one to you. So definitely true leaders understand themselves and how to inspire others. How have you grown as a leader from your time at the GSB?
Yeah, so I think there are a few things that I've noticed in myself, and I've also gotten, you know, feedback from friends and family on having seen progress here, which I think is great, and I attribute a lot of that to the GSB experience. I think one is just in terms of, you know, me being a little bit more empathetic coming out of the program than I had been going in. I mean, I think the course content gears you toward that, but also just being in an incubator type of environment with so many people who are so focused on that sort of thing and connecting with others, I think just gets you more feedback more often and gets you a little bit more attuned. So I think empathy is one thing that I think has stood out, which, you know, sort of impacts all areas of my leadership. I think the second thing is I think the GSB experience made me a bit of a better communicator. Taking classes like managing difficult conversations, like I talked about, but then also just getting me away from writing exclusively in bullets and communicating exclusively through PowerPoint slides. I think just pushed me to find ways to be a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more direct, and a little bit more concise. And then, lastly, I think that as a leader and just in general, my Stanford experience, really just raised the bar in terms of self-improvement overall. I mean, you're around so many driven and amazing people, more than I'd found in college or at any of the jobs that I'd worked with, for sure. And those people become your source of influence and your source of inspiration. And I think that, role models, matter a lot. And I think for me, classmates ended up being a lot of those folks. So I think that, I'm coming out of the time and going back into the professional world, as a more capable leader. At least that's what I hope. And I don't think it's the end of the journey. I think that, the program has given me the tools that I need to continue to get a bit better at that.
Awesome, thank you. I'll do one last question and then we'll take some from the audience. Valerie, tell us a little bit about some extracurriculars that were meaningful to you when you were at the GSB.
Cool. So Kirsten mentioned earlier, I did a ton of extracurriculars at the GSB. So I'll sort of highlight 3 things that were really impactful for me, 2 official, 1 unofficial. So official ones, I saw someone asked about impact investing. I was the chief investment officer of the GSB Impact Fund, which was started around 5 years ago by a bunch of students who thought that it would be pretty powerful if, while at the GSB, we were able to experience impact investing firsthand. So there are a bunch of donors who were nice enough to give us real money that we're able to invest every year. There's a group of now 60 students who do the whole process, from coming up with an investment thesis to sourcing the companies, doing diligence, pitching it to an investment committee, and ultimately investing money in early stage rounds. So it was really exciting to see that. For me, it was much of a leadership practice, in that the hardest thing at the GSB when running an extracurricular is motivating people to actually do work. And the Impact Fund is 60 people. Trying to convince them to stay motivated throughout the whole process was fascinating. The other thing I did is I planned a number of trips. Travel is a huge part of the GSB experience. The one official trip that I planned was a global seminar to China. So it was a group of 25 incoming MBA ones, led by a couple of us, to visit a number of companies and learn about innovation in China. And then the unofficial thing I did is very similar to what Katie mentioned. A couple of my classmates decided to host a dinner series. Kirsten came to one of our dinners. We've since coined it View from the Table, which is a play on View from the Top, a really cool speaker series at the GSB. So View from the Table gets our favorite professors to come for dinner. And these are some of the most fascinating conversations. So I highly recommend it.
That's awesome. Thank you. One of the first questions we've got that has several people asking is it critical for MBA candidates at the GSB interested in pursuing finance to have a background in investment banking and private equity? And I'm going to jump in about this one specifically, but anyone else on the panel, because I know you have finance backgrounds who had friends who were breaking into the industry, it would be helpful to hear from you. There are a couple of coaches that I recently spoke to in preparation for this panel, who've been in investment and entrepreneurs as well in the CMC, and asked that same question for all those who are interested in breaking into this industry, because it is hard to do. What has been our success rate? What are the issues? And really the answer is dedication, dedication, dedication. So it is a lot of work. You may spend 20 to 30 hours just figuring out which company you want to pitch as part of your interviews. So their answer was literally to a person. They were able to help students get a job in private equity by the second year, trying to help them pivot over the summer, who were willing to put in the effort that it really takes to do the networking, to learn, to become an expert in the space. So they certainly saw people who said they'd like to do it, and a few of them drop out over time. But every year, all but maybe one are able to make that pivot, was what their explanation was. But anybody on the panel see that real time with your friends who are trying to make that pivot?
One thing that I saw is the idea of like getting into finance is really broad. So I don't have too much experience of people trying to get into private equity, but a large percentage of my classmates who now work in venture capital didn't work in venture before. I think it's a much less structured process and takes a lot of people who are entrepreneurs or operators. So definitely there you don't need the banking or PE experience.
That's great.
Yeah, and I would add that you know, with my internship, for example, I mean, there were 4 interns in my kind of intern class at Bain Capital. Only 2 of them had prior private equity experience. The others, one was a consultant and one had been in investment banking. So, you know, not looking for prior private equity experience. In terms of breaking into finance for people who have never done it before, I think if you looked at the class of 2019 and, you know, the folks who had gone into, you know, investment banking or like things, I think a lot of those folks hadn't been in finance before. I think it's the investing roles where you know, recruiters tend to be a little bit more particular. But I think for like finance writ large, I think that you know, Stanford actually gives you a great platform to break into that.
Fantastic. So we have a couple MBAs. Matt is asking about if you want to pivot from finance into the startup space, what skills and value does the degree impart upon you? I don't know if any of the panelists did Startup Garage or other things like that, which would give them the ability to become entrepreneurs. Anyone want to speak to that?
I can speak to it. So I guess it depends on whether you're looking to like found a company or just work at a startup. No, I shouldn't say just work at a startup, but work at a startup and kind of be a team member. I would say if you're looking to work at a startup, you're very, very well positioned at the GSB. There's just so many companies that are looking for great alums. And actually, frankly, there's so many great GSB alums that are like, I'd love to have another person on my team that has this shared experience and can kind of help share the load because these companies are growing so quickly. So I'd say you're not going to have a problem there. If you're looking to found a company, again, I would say probably similar to Kristen, to what you said with the dedication piece, with pivoting into investing. There are tons of people in my class who came in and said, yes, I want to start a business. And it was the ones that really, you know, potentially chose that over traveling on spring break or did Startup Garage. There was basically 2 semesters of Startup Garage. So the first one was kind of everyone did it. And then the second one was like, are you really serious about your startup? So it was the people that kind of continued in that process that I saw that are the most successful in actually starting a company. But unlike investing, you know, no one has to really, you know, vet your resume. So the good news is like everyone can give it a go. And I think that's why so many people do really, really well in this space.
Awesome. So Kanak is asking us, oh, sorry, go ahead, Manuel. I'd love to hear from you too. Or no? Emily,
yeah, sure, thanks. Yeah, so, sorry, I have
it's great.
Asking about, I think everything is okay. So if you hear something in the background, it's working from home. So about the skills that at least in my case I got from the GSB, coming from private equity and getting into a startup world and a startup role. So I guess the GSB is an amazing place that can actually teach you how to be a leader. Actually being a leader is actually something difficult to learn, and you actually only get it from practice. But the GSB actually has this format in which you can actually try conversation, and as Jeff mentioned, you can actually get to role play a lot. And these role plays made a difference for me, actually gave me some practice on what kind of decisions I would face and what kind of answers I could get in those roles. So even though getting the skills that you need to be an actual leader, you can only get those with practice. The GSB was amazing in setting me in that path.
Great. How about for the investors, the current investors there? How has your time at the GSB made you a better investor? So Emily, who else would you like to kick off on that? I know you're just coming out, but what would your gut be? How about that?
Yeah, I guess it's unproven, so I can say whatever I want. But I would say what I was going to say about your question on Startup Garage too. I took Startup Garage, including both semesters or both quarters, the like you're serious, you continue sort of thing. And I found it to be really valuable, and it was also just really fun. Part of the Stanford experience that's unique and so entrepreneurial focused. And one thing that was cool was it just focuses on how can you get the best answer you can get quickly, which is very different from what I had learned in investing, which I came from environments that were very well resourced at H&F and at BCG, where you would ask a question, but you had to be fairly certain, and you would do dozens of expert calls and all those things. And for me, it was really helpful to focus on 2 quarters where it was like, okay, we can't do the perfect version of this because we don't have infinite time and resources. Like, how can we get to a pretty good answer fast?
Yeah.
And I think that more like scrappiness approach to problem solving was really helpful for me to explore for a little while. And I also learned a lot more about how to ask better questions. And when so much of our job as investors is how do you get to a unique answer and maybe approach the problem differently or ask better questions, I think even if I can do that 10% better, like that makes me a much better investor.
Anybody else? That might be a critical question. Anyone else on the panel have an opinion about how you become a better investor from Stanford?
Yeah, I could add one point, which is just that I think that one of the things that an MBA really, teaches you is how to find, like, sort of how to get started on really any topic, even if it's not your area of expertise. So, now if we're doing diligence on a business and there's like a demand planning, problem that involves Monte Carlo analysis, it's like, well, that's pretty random, but I did that at Stanford, and then if we're trying to figure out like networking capital optimization, it's not just me leaning on a consultant anymore. It's like, hey, I've actually, built models to figure out like what safety stock should be and what cycle stock should be from, the advanced operations class. Or maybe, you're trying to look at sales force effectiveness, and you're trying to figure out like whether the comp plan that they have in place for the people in the field, makes sense or doesn't. And, again, like took a class on sales force effectiveness at Stanford. So I think it's the sort of thing where it's like a lot of the time in an investing job, you won't really learn about some of these things until you're in a situation that forces you to learn about them. Whereas the MBA does a great job of sort of giving you like the surface level of almost everything. You can choose to go deeper where you want to go deeper, but it does give you the surface level of almost everything, which just means that when something is put in front of you that might be unfamiliar to somebody in your role or of your age who hadn't done the program, I think you're a little bit further along the curve in terms of knowing where to start and sort of like quote unquote like knowing just enough to be dangerous, or like at least sound like you are off to the right start. So I think that's been an area where I've found it to be helpful. I mean, I've been going back to my class notes almost constantly, and one thing I would say to anybody going in is just keep everything on like a online, box drive type of situation so that you can go back to those things. Because my college experience was sort of like you graduate and you kind of just burn it all in the backyard. Like I definitely would not do that here, because I've been going back to this stuff all the time.
Awesome. 6 of our attendees are interested in this answer that this question Karthik is asking. It would be great to hear the panelists speak about the roles the Career Center, professors, and the alumni network played in the recruitment process. What was most important and most helpful?
I would describe them all as kind of like being on your team, and it's like, when do you put them in, and what position do you put them in? So I literally used all 3. I had an awesome advisor at the Career Center, Grace, who kind of, I told her I want to be in Toronto, and she was like, great, I don't really have postings, but I can find you alum, and let's work through it. And it was really more collaborative. Like, she was almost kind of like, well, I guess obviously my coach. Professors were super helpful as well, especially given that I was specific in my scope of introducing me to folks that they knew in Toronto, both GSB alum and just like operators that they had, invested in or written cases on or knew from their network, which was super cool. And then actually the way that I found my first job out of the GSB was I was at a women in management banquet that they have every year, and was sitting with an alum and mentioning to her, she was at probably class of, I don't know, maybe 5 years ahead of me, and said, hey, you know, I haven't found anything yet, but I want to be in Toronto. And she said that her roommate from the GSB from many years ago was from Toronto, and that she would text him right now and see if he had any ideas. He was an angel investor in Open Care, and so I got introduced to Open Care. So I think people are just like really, like if you're open and willing to ask for help, and you're a little bit specific about what it is that you want in terms of industry or geography, everyone is there to help. And I don't think I could have done it without any of those groups that you mentioned in your question.
Awesome. Someone else want to take a stab at that?
Yeah. One thing I'd add is I just think that because so many alum love the GSB so much, people are always eager to help those who are still students, in part because it's like a window into what are things like at the GSB right now. And my example for this is I now go on a walk in my neighborhood every day, you know, like function of COVID life. And I live sort of like pretty close to campus, right on the border with Atherton, where some of the very fancy alum live. And I walked past this guy a couple of times, and then we realized that we had met at a meeting once of the GSB Trust, which does a lot of investing for the GSB. And he recognized me from having presented there for the Impact Fund. And then we ended up going on a walk, and then he was really helpful in thinking through career decisions. And he just also really loved hearing about like, oh, what are the kids these days up to? And I think my takeaway from that is if you want to reach out to any alum, no matter how fancy they may seem, just do it. And often they say yes because they actually view it as a mutually beneficial exchange, and you don't have to feel like a burden.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I could stand up for the CMC, I guess, here too. That's where I had spent most of my time. I mean, you know, you come back in the first year from Christmas break, and you know the CMC's uploaded a bunch of postings all over the world. You know, searchable by location, by title, you know, by specialization, kind of what have you. I found that to be super easy to navigate. It was how I found the job that I'm in now, and you know, I think that there are coaches at the CMC that are great, where if you want to have that one-on-one conversation, you can. But all the online tools are also super intuitive, so it's easy for people to, you know, browse and try to find a good fit.
Awesome. We have a question here about the finance curriculum for people who don't have finance background. It looks like from our questions there's quite a few. Can you speak to the GSB curriculum and what what skills were provided and what knowledge you might, you know, need? So what courses you would take?
I had a finance background, but I'm happy to also talk about it. And there's also a question here that says, like, what's one thing that got better over the course of COVID and when classes transitioned to being online? I think this is an area where things have gotten better and will continue to get better. So I was a TA for a class called Corporate Financial Modeling, which really starts from the basics of like, how do you build the most simple model? And it gets you all the way to doing an LBO by the end of the quarter in just 9 weeks. And in that class, when COVID hit, they doubled or tripled the size of the class without asking the TAs, which was not necessarily my favorite part. But instead of getting 50 students on, they were able to get 150 students on and really provide really in-depth learning because it transitioned really well to a digital medium. So it was something that there's always a ton of demand for, and there's always a long wait list. So they were able to get a lot more people into that class. And then they also transitioned, I thought, really well to digital experience. So that Professor DiMarzo, was pretty thoughtful in terms of how he used all the different tools. And I was really surprised by how professors like really kind of rallied to the cause of teaching in this way. It's new for them too, but I think they've been pretty good about leveraging best practices across all the classes and everything. So there's a lot of different aspects of the finance curriculum that I'll let others speak to, but I would say I think many people will call that class a must, even if you have a finance background. I know many people went back in and tried to kind of fill in the holes of their toolkit by taking that class and thinking about like, okay, if I'm going to audit models that associates are building or something, maybe it's helpful to sort of learn in this way. So that's just one data point.
Great.
I would also just say that one of the things that's pretty special about the Stanford curriculum relative to a lot of business schools is just the flexibility that it gives folks to sort of chart their own path. I mean, you know, you could be somebody, maybe you're somebody who already knows about accounting but don't really know anything about technical finance theory, or maybe you know about the theory but you don't know about accounting, or maybe you don't know about any of it. In each of those tracks, given that you have the base offering, the accelerated offering, the advanced offering, you can customize it to how much you already know, but also how much you want to lean in. And I think that's a lot different than it is at a lot of places where it's sort of, that first year curriculum might be like the 101 suite across the board. Here it's like, maybe I want to go beyond the 101, or maybe I've already done the 101 in some of these things, but not others. So I think that, for me, like, given that I had done an undergraduate business program, that ability to customize was like one of the biggest, edges, I think, for the Stanford program. But I think, I think it applies to people. I think it applies to anyone, really, even somebody who hadn't done a business undergrad, just given that naturally through the course of your work experience, you will have had more exposure to certain things than others. So being able to customize what courses you're taking and how advanced they are, I think is important.
Great. Well, I'm watching the time. I would love our panelists maybe to end with what's some advice? If you could go back a few years and sit in the shoes of the attendees right now, what would you want them to know, either about your experience in business school, or even as you're thinking about, applying what was helpful for you? Anybody want to jump in?
I can go. I would use the time that I'm sure many of you are spending to like reflect and write your essay questions, why you want to come to the GSB or to do an MBA. Use that as like your guidepost when you get to business school for how to spend your time, because you're going to have like an infinite number of different ways that you could spend all day, every day, from socializing to travel to coursework to networking to working at companies, in the Palo Alto area, and you're not going to be able to do all of them. And I think if I could go back, I would definitely have kind of used that as my North Star, and try to say what's really important to me, like the essay question, and how is what I'm doing today aligning with that, so that you can really make the most of the time, because it is really short.
I have a quote up on my wall by Herb Grosbeck, one of our famous professors, that says, "Regret for what you have done can be tempered by time. Regret for what you have not done is inconsolable." And I think that's sort of the essence of what I learned at the GSB, just like take risks, go do things. And I think that applies to like applying to school, to how you're coming up with your career, to all the decisions that you make. Like, just go do things. And if they fail, you're going to be fine. And if they don't fail, you might be successful beyond your wildest beliefs.
Well, I think I'm going to end right there, Valerie. That was nicely said. Our motto is to change lives, change organizations, and change the world. I hope you saw a little piece of that today. Thank you for joining us. And we hope I hope personally I'll have the opportunity to read your application soon. And a big shout out to Emily, Jeff, Valerie, Manuel, and Katie for sharing their time with us today. Thank you, and have a great evening.